Yeah, it has to be intentional.
Yeah.
And actually, unless there's some people in a church being intentional about being neighbourly and being present and actually sharing their lives with each other to serve and be there for Jesus and not just themselves, what they can get out of it, I really worry that our churches aren't going to actually grow if we're not actually that outward looking with our own personal space, sharing our own personal space with another person.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast, and it's awesome to have you along with us. My name's Joel, and I'm here with my regular co-host Stu and Tim. Welcome.
Thank you.
How are you feeling?
Good.
Excellent. That's good. I was going to say, as I always do, comment on your clothes. I'm wearing white. You guys are wearing black.
Yes, yes. And I've had a haircut too.
Yes. I like your haircut.
Thank you.
That's good. Looks trim. Very trim.
Good.
Like, what else are you going to say about me, Joel? Nothing, I promise. I did that before the podcast. Yes, welcome back, Stu. Who did we have on last week? Oh, Anthony, of course.
Anthony.
We had a really good chat with Anthony about
good.
going to
I haven't
Ethiopia.
heard that yet.
Yeah,
I'll
really
have
good.
to listen to that.
But this week we're going to talk about, go back to our discussion on resilient disciples. Tim, you have a cultural artifact for us, a book this time.
Yes.
Because we talked about biblical critical theory last week,
We did talk about
but
biblical
now
critical
we have
theory.
another book.
Well, yes, I have. This one, a little bit newer than that one. This is by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation. Subtitle, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. So I'm about 5 chapters in. I really like Jonathan Haidt. I really, his material, Coddling of the American Mind was one that he wrote a number of years ago, looking at what is happening in our college campuses that mean that you had the young people themselves asking for trigger warnings and asking for people to be deplatformed, and so there seemed to be a lack of resiliency in the young people to not hear ideas that were counter what they already thought. And as a university professor, Haidt and his friend Greg Lukanoff thought this is a bit odd because university is supposed to be a place where you get exposed to radical ideas and crazy ideas and you start playing them off against each other, and it's supposed to be a place that pushes you. Challenges you, yep. And so you had this generation come through, and it felt like all of a sudden. So it felt like the radical change of, hold on, now we've got this generation that are actively seeking not to be exposed to counterfactual arguments. And so they wrote a whole book arguing on that. So that's excellent. And then more recently, Jonathan Haidt's been trying to look at what is the impact of social media and alongside that screen-based childhood. So he's kind of two intersecting but not together, directly overlapping ideas that's causing what he sees as a rise of anxiety and depression and suicide and all sorts of things, particularly in adolescents, and curiously, particularly in adolescent females. It sort of expresses itself differently in adolescent males, but yeah, he's noticing all these upticks, and he's tried to work out what is going on with this generation that is causing these rapid increases of a whole lot of mental health issues. And so his term for that is this rewiring of childhood. So he says, what's going on? There's two things going on at the same time. One is that from sort of the 1980s onwards, there was this decrease of free play outside. So the idea that you would just wander off after school and just play out in the streets in the neighbourhoods and come back when the street lights came on. He said that became a rapid decrease over the 80s and more so in the 90s, and that's kind of now normalised that you don't spend time outside of your home in unstructured free play environments as in childhood. And the other thing coming from he talks about computer gaming in the 80s and 90s that became more sophisticated, and then from the mid-2010s onwards where you've got those computer games and screens in your pocket and all the infrastructure around that, and particularly social media, the rise of that has now created this perfect storm where you used to have free play shaping childhood, and now you've got screen-based, individualised relationships or not relationships forming childhood. And he said those two things combined is the best explanation he can find of why you've got these rapid increases in mental health issues and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm only about 5 chapters in of the book, but I've read a number of his Substack newsletters and heard him on the podcast, so I think I've got a good understanding of the argument he's trying to make. So yeah, I'm finding that quite curious. I know you've read a little bit of him as well. You're familiar with Haidt?
Well, I've been having discussions with my 2 older kids. My son is 10, my daughter is 8, and my daughter doesn't shy away from asking me bold questions like, why can't I have a phone?
Yes.
Things like that. So
Yeah.
I actually bought the book. We haven't read it yet, but I bought it to read with them. I think it might be a bit too dense to go through every single page by page, but incidentally, my son's really interested in maths, and I think there's an opening there's a graph in there somewhere right at the start in the introduction, and he said he looked at it and goes, oh, there's a really big surge, like a really big increase in all of them from about 2008, 2009, which again, we've talked about before, is like when the iPhone was released.
Yes.
And then I know that Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about like that is a huge contributing factor to all of these things, like unfortunately self-harming, youth suicide, increasing anxiety and depression, and all those extra things that have been things probably a bit more difficult for people's or children's childhoods. And it was interesting that he picked that up straight away. And I said, yeah, that's around when the iPhone came out.
Yeah. So the iPhone is kind of one of the notches, and then I think Jonathan Haidt will point particularly to I can't remember the years, but it's when Facebook bought Instagram.
Yep.
And so therefore highly popularised that. And around like 18 months, within 18 months, iPhone brought out the first forward-facing camera, which meant you could selfie while seeing yourself, which made selfies a lot more easy to do. The combination of those two things just increased the ability to put pictures of yourself for the consumption of others out into the world. And his hypothesis is that that's one of the key things, particularly for pre-adolescent and adolescent females. That's why they seem to be most affected, is because Instagram seems to be their social media of choice. And that kind of idea of putting pictures of yourself out there for public consumption and public judging is just, that's how Instagram works. That's the point of Instagram. Yeah. So that's the fuel. And so that's one of his key things as well, is that moment there. Yeah.
What do you think, Stu? I know that you've said that you grew up in a generation where you could play outside and come home when the street lights came on, which is pretty cool. I mean, I kind of think like, I can't see myself doing that as a parent now, but I would kind of wish I did get to play like that when I was a child, at least. And then you're a big fan of Apple products, for example, but then we're talking about the iPhone not being a very, not a great thing for children, maybe. But did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I don't think Haidt is as blunt as saying the iPhone is bad.
Right.
It's a much more complicated argument than that.
Fair enough.
But yeah, it plays into it. But yeah, I'd love to hear your perspectives, Stu.
Yeah, I mean, Haidt talks about a digitalised childhood. So childhood means something very different to pre-digital lifestyles. And there are some generic stereotypes around about what it was like growing up in the 80s, or when I grew up in the 70s even. But I did have some elements of what are the stereotypical lifestyle stuff. Our house backed on the bush, so we used to just go and play in the bush. Yeah. And we used to, there was lots of kids that lived on our street. We lived on a cul-de-sac, very safe area, very privileged area. And we all used just to roam around to each other's houses. 1 or 2 houses on the street had pools, so someone would go for a swim. If you were looking for your friends, you just looked for where all the bikes were. And I think there's a meme these days that say you don't track people on your iPhone to find out where they are. You just look for their bike, and then you found the bike and you go in the house. And in our street we used to not knock. We'd just walk into the house. If all the other kids were already there, you'd knock if you were the first kid, but yeah, we'd just walk in. And I think that was pretty much, I definitely did the whole street lights. That was, Mum said come home when it gets dark. She didn't say when the street lights came on, but she'd say come home when it gets dark, and we go home when it gets dark. Some days we'd play street cricket, and all the mums would come out calling the kids inside, get inside after playing cricket. But that's the experience. I think I look at that and I look at how I've brought my kids up, because Louise and I were only talking about it the other day, because early Gen Xers and late boomers are probably the beginning of the parenting trend of this whole thing. And I think that, Louise and I talk a lot about are we overly concerned about stuff our parents weren't worried about for us? And if we are, why is that? That's an interesting conversation. But one of the things Jonathan Haidt says that I like is, he said once upon a time, if it was raining, kids would run outside and play in the rain or dance around if it hadn't rained for a while, but definitely wouldn't come in just because it was raining. But he says nowadays, if it starts raining, parents might come out and go, quick, come inside before you get killed by lightning. And I think that's a bit extreme example of maybe how things have changed, just perspectives have changed. We look at risk a lot more than the fun. So I think we used to balance that a bit more, like worry less about the risk, I think. I don't know if that's right. I mean, we had boundaries. We were told we weren't allowed to ride our bikes up to the main road. We weren't allowed to go certain places. And of course, as kids, you sort of stretch those a bit. But I don't think my kids grew up, walking through the bush down to the local baths and then swimming by themselves for an hour or two and then coming home, and mum didn't even know where we were. Not that we're hiding it. She didn't care where we were. So you do learn certain life skills when you do stuff like that. But when it comes to our kids too, the other thing that Louise and I have reflected on is that we didn't have anybody giving us any information about the impact of digital devices. And we look back and think if we knew what people know now, we probably would have approached parenting a bit different with our two kids, particularly our youngest kid, Elijah, who was born in 2004, because all this stuff was in full swing a little earlier than 2008, really. And I look back and I think before iPhones, we used to throw kids toys to play, and then when they were so into the devices, we'd let them have the screen. I didn't hear anyone talking about screen time when I was little. When my boys were little, there was just like, oh yeah, there's another thing to play with, go and play with that. And before you knew it, that's all they played with. And then you would say, oh, why don't you go outside and play instead of just playing on that? But then we'd laugh at each other, Lou and I, because our parents used to tell us that with the TV. So why are you sitting there? We used to get told we get square eyes because we were watching TV. So we had a bit of a disrespect for the power of technology, actually, because we thought our parents overreacted with the TV, and we thought it didn't hurt us. So the digital stuff probably won't hurt them either. It's just their version of a TV. But I think it was a lot more powerful.
That's a really interesting point. I remember my mum used to yell at me for playing the PlayStation for too long. And she's like, go out. Why don't you go outside? Yeah. But I was like, well, no one wants to play with me outside. Like, that's not because my sister didn't really want to play with me outside, which is a funny thing.
And I have heard pushbacks against Height's argument that, and one of the pushbacks is that he's just feeding the latest moral panic, and you can trace back moral panics right through the ages. So TV is an obvious one, but hilariously, you can even trace back moral panics to when they first started printing paperbacks.
They did. Well, their books, they thought they were going to go blind from reading too much.
And corrupt the youth because, print shouldn't be that easy to access. And so is Height just playing into the next moral panic is one of the pushbacks that I've heard, and that this is just the next, and in 20 years' time, we won't think much of it. I can see a little bit of that. I do have, I think we've talked before on the podcast, Marshall McLuhan's is a famous sociologist, his idea that the medium is the message. I think there is something about the nature of the technology which does change and shape us and fixate. It alters our perceptions of reality, and that is true for television. And so Neil Postman's famous book "Amuse Ourselves to Death" was all about television and how that was reshaping how we thought and who we are as people. It's interesting. So Dave Stone Street, regular listener, shout out to Dave. I was talking to him not long ago, and he said, we used to a generation ago worry about the moral panic of television. His comment was, how wonderful would it be now for the whole family to be sitting in front of the television all the one time and that's the only screen that they're looking at. We now think of that as a utopia that you can't achieve because everyone is just fractured off in their own rooms.
Seen as the worst thing ever.
Because
they weren't sitting around a radio listening to the radio together, or before that standing around a pianola singing songs together.
So,
what song would you sing if you were on a pianola, Tim?
Always look on the bright side of life.
With your family. I can just see the four of you doing
that. Yep, with the whistles.
I'd like that. I think I'd sing I'm a Lumberjack.
Also a good song.
You're asking for me? Is that what you're looking at me? I'm trying to.
What song would you sing around the pianola?
I don't know. I was trying to think of.
Do you know what a pianola is?
It's a small piano.
Yeah, and isn't it one of those ones that plays itself?
Oh, you
is
can
it?
get those ones, yes.
Yeah,
that's
they're
true.
the ones
with
I'm
the-
thinking. With the little
The rolling cards, yeah.
roll out the barrel. That's probably a good old
That sounds a great
favourite.
one. I was trying to think of like a sea shanty or something.
Yeah, I reckon a
Yeah.
good sea shanty would go down good on a Thursday night after mum's roast.
I tell you what, that'd be pretty good. I think my kids would hate it though. Yeah, it
don't
is
know
that
if
funny thing of like, oh, just stand around and hit the piano and sing.
They did. They sung. They'd have sing songs at
Yeah.
night. Yeah. What else do you do? Got
Well,
no
that's it.
TV.
Yeah,
got
what
no
are the
radio.
other alternatives?
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, is part of that. What Marshall McLuhan would notice is that the medium is the message, as in as new technologies come along, they're not simply replaced. Like watching TV together as a family is not the same as sitting around the TV. In some ways, it's just how you'll entertain yourselves today. But there is actually something about the technology which will shape you and who you are as a person and your expectations of society and culture, and also like it does shape us a lot more than we often give it credit for. And I think it's part of Haidt's argument, although I haven't seen him reference McLuhan explicitly, is that idea that actually having individual phones and the way that we interact that and put information out there into the world in order to be judged, and the psychological hacking that gets done by the companies that want our attention and economy, all of that kind of stuff is very real, and it does actually shape who we are. So, having dinner together and then all splitting off with your individual phones to do your own social media or YouTubing is actually fundamentally different. Now, is it fundamentally different bad, or is it just fundamentally different neutral? Or like there's still evaluative questions you need to ask, but it is something that is significant to notice.
I'm always thinking now about how there is we talked about this before, there's like a reaction. There's maybe a moral panic, and there's a reaction that like, this is really bad, and then so there's maybe the generation reacts differently to it. Tim, you found an article that I'll ask you to talk about in a second about young Generation Z Catholics wanting to go back to traditional mass. But I also see there's other things like, you see it on the internet. Have you seen the trad movement, where it's a number of women dress up as from the 50s and then bake at home and do all those kind of things, which is I just find it interesting that the internet heightens and speeds that process up too. So we'll find out there's a panic, and then look, there's a new movement that takes over or doesn't take over, I should say. It comes as a reaction to that. But then there's also people going, oh, that's ridiculous too. Why would you ever want to go back to that? So it's funny that something that, again, like the internet and talking about from 2008, changes so many things in our life but we always react with this kind of fraughtness, and you've talked about that before, Stu, about the fraughtness and panic of what's going to happen. I think it's always interesting to come back to like, well, if as Christians, the foundational thing is like, well, God is eternal and He's there all the time, that we can approach it with confidence and looking in a way as we can observe it. We talked about this in the 2 weeks ago, Stu, about cultural discernment. We can observe it, look at it, but not be because of that foundation of Christ. We can be we can deal with this. We can make this makes sense to us. Do you want to tell us about that article that you found about the young
I just read
Catholic
this
people?
last night. It's on abc.net.au. The title is "Young Catholics Defy Pope, Choose Latin as Rift Grows in Australia's Biggest Church." The idea is that there are these young Catholics in their mid-20s who are intentionally choosing to go to Latin Mass and very traditional expressions of Catholic Church. The thing that's really interesting about this movement, which is drawn out in the article, is that the current Pope is perceived by many to be much more progressive than previous popes. Attempts either by direct speech or sometimes even by just avoiding particular topics, seems to be more accepting of a number of progressive values, which people on the more progressive side of the faith or of culture are championing and say, yep, this is wonderful, isn't it great that the Catholic Church is coming along with these more progressive ideas? But you've got this sort of counter action by these young Catholics saying, no, I guess maybe it does relate to that trad movement that you mentioned, Joel, that they're saying, no, we actually want things to be more traditional. We want things to be more strange, more mystical. Like they actually are looking for what the authenticity is drawn out in the article. That was one of the sort of bylines that they used. And this idea that you achieve authenticity by actually being strange, by actually being different, by being not following along with whatever the progressive culture is, but going back to original things, which is really, it's just a bit curious. And not, as I read the article, it was interesting to see these young people who would prefer to go to a traditional Catholic Mass in a language that they don't necessarily even understand, but they are sensing for themselves something interesting, something powerful, something that like they're giving all this meaning to this particular church service, and saying, yeah, we would prefer this than a Christianity that just went with the cultural times and became more progressive and etc. So yeah, it was just curious as we think about ministry to young people. Obviously we are not Catholics, and so there's going to be a lot of differences both theologically and in practice to what is noticed in this article. But as we think about ministry to young people, what is actually going to be interesting to them, what's going to be attractive to them, and much more importantly than those questions, what do they actually need? Like what they, you know, as we think about how do we present Jesus to young people, you're noticing here a tension, maybe two poles of an argument. One is you could capitulate to culture, which, you know, some of the progressives think that the Pope is heading more towards that idea, or you can be completely contrary to culture, and the common thought is often, if you just capitulate to culture and you package Jesus in that much more progressive culture, that'll be attractive to people. But you see here that people are not being attracted to that, at least in this particular circumstance. So I just thought that was a curious movement.
Well, it's interesting. There's someone within the article that's quoted as saying that they travel nearly 35 kilometres across Melbourne to attend a particular Latin service, which I thought was interesting. You wouldn't really consider young people that desirous to travel 35 kilometres just for a mass. So it's interesting that they've pulled that out and seeing what's going on here. If we move on also to another book that we're talking about, which is Faith for Exiles, which is talking about the practices of resilient faith. And the third practice, which I thought we could focus on this week, though, and I think it plays into a number of things that we've talked about, is practice 3, which is when isolation and mistrust are the norms, forge meaningful intergenerational relationships. I thought that was a really cool thing that we would probably echo. We would like to echo, because that's obviously how we like, one of the strategies we like to employ at church, or not employ, we like to follow at church. But also the other thing is that there's a number of reasonable explanations of why he thinks what young people are dealing with. One of them, which he titles, the author's title, Isolation Nation, is an epidemic of loneliness. And then we've talked about that before, Stu, but it says here that Barna's data shows that adults are twice as likely to say they are lonely compared to a decade ago. And about 1 in 5 Americans say they feel lonely. And I know that you've said before that it's a rising demographic in Australia. In terms of like being Christians, how do you think that we start approaching like an issue with like that? Because if people are feeling lonely, they feel more isolated, and they're missing a community, how do you think we can look at that as Christians and go, what is that something that we can observe in culture, and how can we maybe helpfully respond to that in a way that can lead them to thinking about God?
I've been thinking a fair bit lately about how when people come to church, there's not a uniformity amongst the congregations in terms of the depth of the relationship that people form with each other. And we've talked about that on the podcast in the past, but one of the things I think a lot about is how open are we in our churches to new people coming into our lives, not just being at our church. I think there's a sense that we would like our churches to grow, we'd like our churches to have new people come, but I don't think a lot of of Christians actually think through, what does that look like for my lifestyle if that happens? So I think on the one hand, people are happy to say, oh, our church is growing and all these new people are coming, isn't that great? But who looks into how those people get integrated into the church naturally amongst the relationships amongst people? I think a lot of Christians in local churches assume someone else is going to talk to that person, but then this brings up another thing. It's like people come to church if they're lonely. They come in through the door and they're looking for relationships with people. But I think we're quite good at being pleasant strangers with each other in the church. So some churches have the good thing that a lot of people are related to each other, but the shadow of that is that there's kind of a closedness to that circle that don't include other people into that circle. Some people go to local churches where they have really good friends, sometimes lifelong friends, and someone comes into that church. Is that circle of friends open to growing and becoming a bigger circle of friends? Like a group of people who might go out for coffee with each other, would they be willing to bring this brand new person along to coffee with them? I don't think they would. And so it doesn't surprise me that our churches aren't growing, because as Christians, I don't know how much we're interested in growing our friends, how many friends we have and how many relationships we have with other people. And we'll use excuses like, oh, well, there's only so many people I can be in relationship with, or, the world's a scary place, like this safetyism thing of Jonathan Haidt or whatever. But this idea of we want the church to grow, but we don't want to actually be the person who forms a really deep and abiding long-term, low-key relationship with those people who come.
Right.
So I think there's time for a conversation in the church about the depth of the welcome that people receive when they come to church. Are they actually welcomed into our lives, or are they welcomed into the space?
Do you think also a contributing factor that might be culturally that we're almost like, because of this constant connectedness with our phones and the internet, that we're tricked into thinking we all are connected? Like it's almost like a facade of thinking that I can access almost anyone else in the world, but then when it comes to like physical reality, we're saying, oh, like they'll be fine. They're probably connected somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, people drive past churches all the time now to go to another church, and people looking for a church with people like themselves, and people who visit are looking for a church with people like themselves. And I think when people come through the door who fit into the abiding culture that a group in the church might have, they might get organically accepted because they're similar to the person that's there. But I think that the increase of choice in technology has probably made it worse, that we have more choice, and that means we can drive past churches that we don't think we have anybody in common with, just like we might make a relationship with someone in America on a computer game who likes the same computer game. We might end up talking to them more than we talk to people who live next door to us. So I think we've lost this sense of neighbourliness, that we can be a good neighbour to people who aren't like us, but it's important to be neighbourly to everybody. I think we've lost that sense in our culture. I think we're more focused on being friends with people who like the same things that we like, and that general neighbourliness is lost on trains these days. Like sometimes I think back to when I was growing up again, and people seem to be a bit more likely to talk to each other on a train. I mean, people were always reading newspapers and things like that, but people would have a bit of banter, or how you going, how's the morning? But if everyone's got headphones on and a screen in front of them, it's even more isolating than a newspaper used to be. I mean, I remember looking down a carriage and seeing people with the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was such a big newspaper that you actually need to do a course to teach you how to fold it on a train to be able to read the thing. And people who were good at it used to be proud of it. My dad would go, oh, I have to teach my son how to read a newspaper. And I remember my dad went and bought a Sydney Morning Herald so that when I got my first job in the city, I'd be able to fold a newspaper. And I'd like, but Dad, I only read the first column on column 8 for the funny story, and then go to the back and read the sport. I don't need to read all this other stuff. I exaggerate a bit there, but yeah, I think there's the more choice we get, the more lonely we get, because it's rarer and rarer we're going to find someone who's interested in what we're interested in. I mean, how many people would be interested in what I'm interested in at the moment? Probably nobody else. Mm-hmm. Like, I've got such a strange array of interests that I watch on YouTube. At the moment, the algorithm's pushing me English soccer chants from the Euros. So imagine if I went to a church looking for someone else who liked listening to English soccer chants from the Euro Cup, by the way, soccer competition over in England at the moment.
Germany.
And they sing, Germany, and they sing funny songs, and I like listening to them. But people who like history, there's not many people who like history in my church. And I sit down next to someone and start talking about Elizabethan England, and the screensavers go on. Because now, partly I need to have better social skills and know when to stop talking, but it really is a case of people. What does it look like to share our lives with each other? It's such an important question. What does it look like to be a church? What does it mean so that people aren't lonely? Is it as simple as really well-structured church with Bible studies and youth groups and kids ministries and all these different ministries that work really well? But people can be lonely in amongst all of those, and they can fall through the gaps. I think it's actually, how do we help our Christian members of our churches open their hearts a bit more to be neighbourly to people who aren't like them?
I really like that because it feels like also that ubiquitous choice. You can choose whatever you like. I feel that it would affect our discipleship as well. Tim, do you think that's the case? And how, like going off what Stu's saying, how do you think that we can establish more meaningful relationships to help people feel less lonely, as Stu's saying?
Yeah, I was thinking about the intersection between relationships and that technology that you were talking about earlier. And one of the, as you said, Joel, the false understandings we can have is that we have all of these relationships, and you can only have and maintain a certain level of number of relationships in your life. We have a particular capacity as humans, but things like Facebook particularly, and others that are networking you to friends that you have, and it might be past friends, it might be people you went to school with 20, 30 more years ago. It might be people that you had a brief acquaintance with at a meeting, at a Bible study, at a conference, at a work event that you've become Facebook friends with. And so suddenly you end up with hundreds and hundreds of people on social media that you're connecting with, and you feel like you're putting some of your relational time into. And if our relational capacity is a limited resource, which it seems to be, then by the time we come to the incarnate relationships with people at church, as Stu said, many of whom don't share the same interests as I do, so might have to take a little bit more effort to talk to, and I might have to be curious about things that they're interested in that I'm not particularly interested in by nature, and they have to be curious about the things that I'm interested in, listen to some 90s Christian punk information. And passion, they're the kinds of things that are hard, and so it's easy to come and have surface relationships at church and then retreat back to the people who really know me, which are the ones who I've self-selected over digital means because they have the same interests as me, whether it be English soccer chants or SpaceX watching or whatever it might be. But
it's someone who wants to watch rockets. Well, what a nerd.
But I think with all of that. So in order to have relational capacity for the people in front of us who are at church, and the phrase you always use, Stu, letting God choose our friendships for us because it's the people who rock up at church. Well, they're my friends, and I think back to times before we had these kind of digital technologies. You think about missionaries who left England and went to countries all over the globe, and there was no expectation that maybe other than an occasional letter that they would maintain the relationships that they had back in England. They had the people in front of them that they were forming connections with and forming relationships with. And it wasn't that long ago, if you moved even just the next town over or a few suburbs away, that you wouldn't expect to maintain all of the relationships that you had in your old life with your new life. And yet, because of the ability to do so with technology, we sometimes are holding all of that intention together. And so part of it is that realignment of our expectations of this community here at church. This is my most real community and my most in-person community. And this is the people that God has put in front of me to love and to care for and to be the body of Christ with. And if we take those theological categories seriously, whether it be body of Christ categories or household of God or, the friendship category that's really important to us at Soul Revival. These are those people. And so these are the people who are most significant for me to dig deep with. And so if we have those kind of communities, then that will, and then a new person walks through the door. If we have this kind of, I'm deep friends with the people here, and we have an outward looking friendship. So then when the new person walks in the door, we are longing to scoop them into that and say, oh, come in, please. You and I, these people, they're my really good friends, and you've just walked in the door. You come and be, let me introduce you to our friends. And we have the space and the ability to do that. And again, part of that is structural. One of the things we've intentionally built at Soul Revival, we talk about all the time, is the meals. That creates an opportunity where you can sit down with a new person and have long conversations with. But it also provides opportunity for me to just catch up with my really close friends that have a lot in common with me, that I'm related to or have been best friends with for the last 30 years, and have a small insular, not outward-looking friendship, but an inward-looking friendship. So you can use those meals in a number of ways, but the more people who can see those as outward-looking friendships and be intentionally looking to scoop people into those, use things like the meal times or the long supper times or the long morning tea times or whatever it is at our different gatherings to facilitate that, then, we should be able to scoop people in. And we've got people at our church who are at our church because that's what they found. That's what they experienced. They came in and they found a community that was welcoming and loving and that they were wrapped into and spent a long time together, and that they knitted themselves, that they were able to be knitted into our community quickly and well and richly and deeply, which is a great thing. But I think one of the things we're noticing is that, in some of our gatherings, we've kind of reached a point where we don't have to do that. There's already enough people there that you don't have to be intentional with the person walking in the door. And we want to be thinking, no, we don't want to lose that. Let's keep pushing ourselves to have that welcoming community.
Yeah, I think something that I'm picking up from you saying is like, what are we intentionally doing as well? Because I think there's when you go out to intentionally try and serve people and just forge relationships with people that you may not otherwise have done, I think there's something in that you end up actually feeling better about yourself. Not in a way of being patronising, but I want to go and find and help people that I'm able to just love and just take care of them in that particular moment, where there's just a conversation or sitting down for dinner, or just say, hey, it's cool that you're here, or I don't know, there's be other things like that. I mean, looking at Faith for Exiles, they give their own definition of what they think a meaningful relationship is like. A relationship is like based on their research that they've done, and they say relationships are meaningful when we are devoted to fellow believers we want to be around and become. And then the next thing is simple, right? But I was going to ask you, Stu, what's your reaction to that, and do you think it's as simple as what perhaps that sounds?
Yeah, I think it is simple, but it's also incredibly complex.
Yes.
So to actually do it is more complicated than it sounds. I think that we didn't used to talk a lot when I was younger about meaningful relationships in church. We didn't talk about community too much. We used to assume all that happened. And funnily enough, looking back, maybe in my early days, maybe it did. Like the fact that we were in proximity with one another and there wasn't the internet, there wasn't all the other distractions in the world that people could choose relationships in so many different places. If you only got your relationships with the kids at school, kids at soccer, kids at church, well, you're friends with all those kids. Not all kids get on. So even in the old days when I was growing up, there were kids that you didn't hang out with and didn't hang out with each other. There were families that argued with each other, that didn't like each other and were pleasant to each other at church but didn't really like each other. There's always been that sort of dynamic. But I think it's maybe partly a product of how we do church now, where we focus in on taking away as many cultural boundaries as we can to make it as easy as we can make it for non-Christian people to come to church, that we try and create like groups that are there for people to join so that they can make a meaningful relationship with people who are at the same age or stage as them. It has a lot of repercussions, because I think that snowballs into microcultures within that gathering that mean it's not just about being young, but there's a reality that within youth culture there's lots of sub-tribes still, even though some people say it's not as pronounced as it used to be. But there are lots of different sub-tribes, there's different kinds of kids. And I was only talking to some parents 3 weeks ago who were saying that their child doesn't get into some of the cultures that are already at our church, which is completely understandable because not all kids, get on with each other. But there's a sense amongst that family that there's a core group of kids who seem to all be in with each other, and they've not really continued to grow outside of the particular group they're in now, and they're not embracing other kids from church. And there's the perennial problem, for example, of quiet kids and kids that are boisterous. So this particular group is full of what these kids consider to be boisterous teenagers, so they don't really feel included, and they assume a lot of stuff. They assume they're not welcome, and they assume that they can't be a part of it, where the other kids are just like, yeah, of course you can be part of it. But again, that's not a brand new thing, but I think that's one of the barriers I see to churches growing as healthy discipleship spaces and growing numerically, that there's just so much complication amongst human relationships, and yet we spend so little time with each other. So is there an expectation that we're going to be able to become really close to each other and be included in a church if we only go once a fortnight to church for half an hour and maybe 15 minutes after church? And then maybe someone who is only able to commit that amount of time to church looks at people who also lead in a ministry or also are a part of another Bible study, and then they might look at those relationships and feel a bit jealous and wish they could be part of it. But likewise, the Bible study members who are coming regularly get used to seeing regular faces, and maybe they're a bit blinkered to being neighbourly to people who aren't. I think a big thing could be in this conversation, and it would work with intergenerationality as well, is just consider presence to be an important thing, to actually be present in each other's lives and to lessen people's expectation on relationship in the early stages of relationships. Just be neighbourly, just be friendly with each other, and spend a bit of time getting to know people. And maybe actually, instead of only serving after you have intimacy with a group of people at church, maybe serve first, and then the intimacy with that group of people will grow. Because it seems to me that if we're serving Jesus and partnering with him in some part of his great project to grow the church, even if it's in our little local church with our little team that runs dinners, if you get involved with running a dinner once a month even, and then you're there with a group of people serving together, I think that's a terrific way to actually form friendships, because by serving in kids ministry or youth ministry or whatever it might be, you just end up being present in each other's lives. And I think maybe we're a very verbal culture, and maybe we think that we need to grow closer to each other through conversation, and that's only heightened by technology because it's a form of communication. And so this communication is what actually brings me together with someone else. And what if I'm communicating about the same kind of stuff and enjoying that communication, then that's going to be a really core part of our experience. But if I actually put that aside a bit and I'm actually focused on serving Jesus with another person, then we start talking about the things we have in common, which come out of the ministry that we're actually in together. And so I think in our culture we might actually be, just to investigate that neighbourly presence a little bit more.
I think I just love that bit where you said like the presence is where meaningful relationships can start, just being present with one another. And we've harked back to a number of different type of statistics that say a regular churchgoer is someone that goes once a month. So how can you form, I think that's part of what you're heading towards, is like, how can you form meaningful relationships if you're only in the presence of one another once a month?
Well, you can't.
You can't. Right?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be friendly and friends, but unless you spend more time with each other. So,
yeah. I think
so then it's a case of how do you spend more time, and there's all that conversation. But yeah, I think that the more you're serving Jesus, the less you're spending time ruminating on your own problems and your own concerns as well. So when you're helping to solve other people's concerns and you're serving others, that is got to be a part of helping people to break out of loneliness and break out of all that. So, but I really think as churches we need to think through who's going to welcome someone into the church. Welcoming is not just hi, welcome, but who's going to actually bring someone relationally into the gathering of God's people? Who's going to be present with them? Who's going to be thinking, I'm going to have a coffee with my friend, my best friend who I see all the time, and I love that and I really enjoy it. But you know what? I could share one of those coffees with this new lady who came to church on the weekend, and I could ask her to come. You probably only need to do that once and she'd feel so blessed. But we don't do that, I don't think. I don't think we kind of restrict our presence to the formality of the compartmentalized spiritual gathering of God's people, and then we're not thinking about how we can live lives together that are actually all of life, rather than just these sections that we've devoted and said, okay, I'm a busy person, but I'll give God X, Y, and Z. But, you know, maybe if you kind of blur those lines between what is the church and what is your social time, that might be a cool thing.
I like that. Again, harking back to that, like, what are you doing intentionally to make it happen?
Yeah, it has to be intentional.
Yeah.
And actually, unless there's some people in a church being intentional about being neighbourly and being present and actually sharing their lives with each other to serve and be there for Jesus and not just themselves, what they can get out of it, I really worry that our churches aren't going to actually grow if we're not actually that outward looking with our own personal space, sharing our own personal space with another person that we're getting to know in a safe way.
And I think also, and something that we really value is a way of doing that is also amongst the generations, not just in the same generations. There's a little story here in Faith for Exiles where Mark Matlock is one of the authors, and they had a slightly older woman who she volunteered to help in the youth group that Mark was leading, and she made individual birthday cakes for each of the students that were there, and especially decorated them for their personalities and interests. And if some of the girls that were attending were just saying how amazing the cakes were, and they tasted amazing, they're like, "What mix do you use?" And she's like, "Mix." So she was like super offended. She's like, "This doesn't come out of a box. I make it from scratch." And the girls looked at each other and then asked, "What does from scratch mean?"
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And then apparently from what happened next, that cooking lessons started happening at that woman's house, and a lot of people were learning how to bake cakes and to make Thanksgiving dinners and stuff like that. So it's kind of combining a lot of the things we're talking about, is like sharing time over meals, but also being present with each other and being present across the generations as well. So I just wanted to lead into a question to ask you, Tim, is that obviously someone that you lecture on intergenerationality. How do we see that approach as a way of kind of mitigating against or increasing the opportunity for meaningful relationships?
Yeah, well, and I think part of it is that the meaningful relationships don't have to just be peer-to-peer. And that's what intergenerationality is really highlighting, is that these significant relationships can happen intergenerationally, like between generations. And so sometimes, again, you have people come to church and they look around and go, "Oh, there's no one here my age, I'll go somewhere else." And that's, they're just reflecting the values of our society and our culture, and sadly too often our churches, which says that, your friends will be the people who are closest to you in stage of life, age, etc. And so if there's not enough young families here and I'm a young family, I'll go to somewhere else. Or if there's not enough middle-aged single people and I'm a middle-aged single person, then I won't fit in here. I need to go find a church where that's true of me. And whatever the demographic is, and there are so many different versions of who you can be, is that you will find someone with people who are most like you. But the key thing that intergenerationality is trying to draw out is that you can actually have significant meaningful relationships, and from a Christian point of view, significant discipling relationships, which in generations other than the one that you are in. And so you want to have your closest friendships are those who are outside of those spheres. And at a micro level, I mean, the three of us are all micro generations away from each other. None of us are exactly the same life stage or age, and yet we're really good friends with each other, and we see each other.
I'm not.
Well, yeah, Stu's not a friend, but the rest of us are.
Wow. You chose the podcast to really tell us how you feel.
Oh, look, I pay to be here.
So am I.
Actually, all three of us are.
You got to cut all that out. Sorry, that's
No,
enough.
leave that in. That's
You
fine.
reckon leave it in?
Yeah,
All right,
leave it.
let's leave it in. Well, if we're really going to leave it in, let me really tell you what I think.
Okay.
I think you're both great. Sorry, go on.
No, that's all right. This is a good example that we actually see each other genuinely as friends, and we can muck around like that.
Yeah,
because,
true.
The friendship. I don't have to find other, old millennials who are exactly the same stage of life as me. We've got a younger millennial with a slightly different age of life with younger kids
and clothing color profile.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you don't have to wear black.
You
for us
don't
to be
understand
friends.
rock and roll, Joel. We were talking about this before the podcast.
Oh,
All
I do.
black is not being a pallbearer. It's actually rock and roll. Isn't it, Tim?
That's absolutely, yeah.
See? There you
So
go.
we're aligned in this, even though we're generationally different.
Yeah, that's true. Living example.
And I think what it also creates is you will have, it might be like the family that you talked about, Stu, that this teenager who doesn't have the peers of that teenager don't have things in common, but maybe there are others in the congregation who can be significant, meaningful mentors to this young person, and that they can be knitted into other, relationships and conversations in, obviously healthy, in safe and appropriate ways. And for that young teenager to feel that they can serve in ministry alongside others, and that might be a way that they can find belonging. That belonging and identity doesn't have to come from having a particular peer group who is exactly like me, but it's having a community of difference that accepts me in the way that I am, encourages me to be more Christ-like in that, and is friendships with me despite difference. And so I think that that's a really key thing that we can see. And often we realise that those who are most like us may not necessarily be the most healthy, formative people anyway, because actually if we all just sit around and talk about how hard it is to parent teenagers, actually what we need in that is to have people of Stu's generation who are empty nesters who have gone through the teenage years to come alongside and say, oh, you're going through this stage. Yeah, I remember that stage. There's some really tough times there, but let's remind you of the really beautiful times you're also seeing, and also here are some strategies to help you and your kids thrive together in this stage of life. That is needed, and so we need to have those kind of conversations as well.
No, I think you're really right. There's multiple times where I've had conversations like that, being a parent or not even being a parent, where an older Christian has come alongside and said, oh yeah, but this happens and it'll be okay, and this is what happened to me, and I really value that. Even in Faith for Exiles, it says that resilient disciples are more intergenerationally connected than their peers, which they would not describe as resilient disciples. As an example, 4 out of 10 resilient disciples, more than double than any of other groups, have had an adult mentor at the church, other than a staff member. And more than half of resilient disciples look to an older person for advice when making difficult decisions. And Stuart, someone that's really inspired us to think intergenerationally and the benefit that has. Can you think of an example where, or even just an idea around how you have seen being more intergenerational has created more resiliency amongst a group of people that you're leading, or even just amongst the church community?
Yeah, Helen Cameron says that lived experience is really important to take into account when you think about things like this, because you can be teaching a certain concept to a group of people, but they're going to be listening to that through the lens of their own life experience.
Yep.
And the problem for helping people to engage with becoming friends with people at different ages is they might not have a lived experience of that. So that goes both ways. So the lived experience of many boomers and X's and millennials in Australia is homogeneous unit gatherings where they only gather with people who are like them. And they've also become fairly transient, many people. If they're living in an area where there's lots of churches around, they're looking not only for an appropriate, church that teaches the Bible, they also are looking for, is there a group of people there that I will get on with and become good friends with? And so they're used to seeing it from that consumable point of view. So younger people, on the other hand, they've experience of church is often kids ministry, youth ministry, and then, hanging out with other younger Christians. And even if they're new to the church and they haven't gone through those programs, they're not used to many aspects of other than family and maybe a sporting coach or a music tutor or something. There's not a lot of interaction with adults in their life really that goes beyond transactional. So the teacher is a transactional relationship that lasts for a while and then they move on. They've been taught in their life, in their lived experience, that you don't make relationships with older people that last very long, and they're there to guide and look after you. And in some ways, they're there to actually create, to help you to create a space and a place where you can be in a closer proximity with people your age. So to actually have someone step out of that life experience and try something different is a bit of a challenge. So I've noticed though that when we tell stories from the Bible and we teach that the Bible almost gives us permission to be reconciled to people that we wouldn't normally be reconciled to. Reconciliation is obviously between people who are at enmity with one another, but I think there's also a stretch there where we can talk about people of otherness coming together who aren't actually like each other, being reconciled, brought together, people who wouldn't normally be together. So at one level, there is enmity between Jews and Greeks, but at another level, there's just these parallel lives that they live. And I think for us, it's not necessarily, although it can be, I mean, young people and older people can be at enmity with each other when they don't like the same music or they don't appreciate different aspects of lifestyle between the two different generations. But when people can come together and be when we teach that we are reconciled to God, and that there was a time where we didn't even pay God any attention, but now actually He's the most important reality in our life. And then all of a sudden we're thinking of that. And we talk a lot about personal transformation in our preaching, but do we talk much about community transformation? Do we teach how, yes, your lived experience is X, but actually we can grow through sanctification and through being equipped by the Holy Spirit to have the same compassion of Christ. And when Christ looked at the crowds, he had compassion. He didn't just look at them and go, oh, they need a feed. They're all hungry. He had compassion. And so he gives out of love. When we share the gospel with someone, it's out of love. When we share hospitality with someone, it's out of love. But I think in our culture, we're almost only loving people who love us back. And so that's where I come back to this neighbourliness. There once was a time where neighbours would go out onto the street, coming full circle back to the times we go out on the street, and be in the gardens, in their front yards, and they would talk to each other. And one neighbour might say, and this is getting to your question, but one neighbour might say, hey, here's some shears. Looks like your shears are blunt. Or hey, give me those shears, Ethel, and I'll give them to Jack, and he'll sharpen them for you. And Jack, Ethel's blades blunt again. He's like, oh, coming out. And then Ethel says, look, while you're doing that, I'll make you a cup of tea. Where are those interactions in our society in general anymore? They're not there anymore. But likewise, there was a healthy way for young and old people to come into those kind of connectednesses with, Jack, the boy across the road, David, his bicycle chains come off, his mum's come over, can you help fix that? Yeah, I'll fix that for him. And so there was a kindness that's extended. Even if Jack doesn't talk to the boy, he just fixes his bike for him and gives him the bike. There's a humanness to that interaction. There's a presence that isn't kind of there anymore. It's not transactional. It's actually compassionate, and it's about love. And so teaching us to have the fruit of the Spirit has got to actually eventually have an outcome of intergenerationalness, unless we say only apply this fruit of the Spirit to this category of person, which is exactly like you. So the lived experience is, it's common sense for me to only express my Christian fruitfulness to people who are like me, but we need to be taught from the Word of God that there's actually a bigger world out there we can explore. So I think teaching can teach that. So one example I've seen that was an example of that was, which I've shared on the podcast before, but, having a Relo bash where the elders come together with the young crew and have a feed together, and they just sit next to each other and talk. Even if you don't have a meal every week like we do, there are the old fellowship teas churches used to have where I don't think you're allowed to have potluck dinners anymore because I think that breaks some kind of food code or something. But bringing people together to have a feed is good. Back in the old days at church, we used to have a thing called a Lamington drive, which probably with health restrictions you're not allowed to have anymore either. You'd probably only make $20, but the whole church would come together and all the older people and the younger people would make Lamingtons together and spend hours in the kitchen for this fundraiser. I don't know. Is there things in our churches where we can not pay the cleaner anymore and try and help encourage people that there's a way of coming and cleaning the church where we can do it together? And stuff like that might be able to happen.
As if like sometimes the individualism that's only been accelerated by the internet has caused us to forget those things about.
So here's the thing: is it just enough to remind them, or remind and show? That might be something for you guys to tell me what you think, because I think sometimes when we preach, we're showing people. We're reminding people, and we use examples in our sermons of showing people. But until they actually see some lived experience, I've preached a sermon, dead set on, it'd be really good if we all just get involved with the little things in church. It'd be really cool if instead of us all just worrying about what's the big, ministry of my life, if you see some plates on a table that no one else has picked up, maybe pick them up and take them to the kitchen and just do the little things like that to serve. And I walked out of the auditorium into the kitchen, not the kitchen, the cafe that we're in, and I saw an 80-year-old lady struggling with 2 plastic bags full of rubbish, walking through a room full of 100 people, and no one stopped to help them, because they probably presumed that's that person's ministry. And isn't it lovely that they're doing that ministry for me? But I'm like, I went over and said to that person, can I grab a bag? And they're like, oh, thank you, that'd really help. And even after I said, can I grab a bag, no one else came and helped us, because it was still quite a lot for 2 people to carry. So I think I wonder if there needs to be a really big shift in our showing of what church is, and actually try and live out some of that praxis of being present and actually noticing things again, noticing when someone sits by themselves. I'm fascinated that people can sit by themselves in church. That should be an emergency. There should be, everyone in church should go, oh, you got someone to talk to? They should get sick of people asking them. Yeah. Oh, is someone talking to you? But we don't. We're selfish, sinful human beings. We do think about our own needs. But yeah, it always strikes me as unusual that someone can sit in a church full of 100 people and sit by themselves. Because if we had the same compassion for Christ, he had a compassion on the crowds. It's almost like we need to have compassion on the single person who's sitting by themselves in our day and age.
And I like that bit where you're talking about, it's almost, I wonder if some of the times we like, let's not give unless I'm going to get something back.
Yeah,
let's
I think so.
Let's give or serve.
Yeah.
Why are we not giving or serving without expectation?
Yeah.
Nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we create these kind of ways of talking within Christian circles too. I call them Christian myths. It's things like I've heard a tradesman once say, churches use and abuse tradespeople, so I'm very careful how much I offer to do. And then I've also heard people say, oh, well, I'm with kids all week, and I don't want to do anything with kids on the weekend. And now both those, I see there's a bit of truth. There could be a bit of truth in both those things. But how do we as a group of Christians have that conversation so that we don't use people, but we also help people to use the gifts God's given them for the sake of the body to build up the church as well, in ways that don't burn them out. Now, obviously if someone's tired all week being a primary school teacher, maybe the last thing they feel like doing on a Sunday morning is teach the kids in the class, but surely there's something they can teach us about teaching kids. Maybe there's got to be a bigger vision for what the local church is.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I was just going to wrap up, but Tim, I saw you feverishly searching. Are you looking up something that you wanted to contribute?
Your comment about your sermon, Stu, and then not having any follow-through reminded me of a psychological study that was done on why people help others. And it was done at a theological seminary.
Okay.
They had 67 theological students prepare a sermon on the Good Samaritan, and then in order to deliver, and then they were preparing in a cohort, and then at the end of that preparation time, the person at the front randomly assigned these people to a couple of groups. One group was, oh, sorry, you're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago. You better get moving to go and deliver this sermon. And the other group, they said, yeah, you got plenty of time, but you might as well start moving now. And then they had arranged that in between the classroom where they were preparing and the place that they were delivering the sermon, there was a person slumped over in a doorway, coughing and spluttering, clearly in distress. Only 10% of the people who had just prepared a sermon on the Good Samaritan and were in a hurried condition stopped to help the person. So here are people who are thinking theologically about this topic and yet 90% failed to actually enact their own sermon in the immediate 4 parts there. Whereas 63% of those who were told they had plenty of time to make it to the sermon delivery point, but they might as well get started now, 63% help, which still means that you've still got 37% who didn't help the person. So you've got this disconnect between this, as you say, Stu, like teaching and showing, like that. Even the people who were preparing the sermon were failed to enact the message of the sermon in the person directly in front of them, which is fascinating.
That's really interesting because that connects really well with Cameron, because she would say the reason for that 10%, or the 90% not actually connecting, would be partly due to their life expectations, their life experience, their lived experience in churches, where there's always lots of people who have ministries who are going around doing things. Someone will look after that one because I am actually engaged in this important endeavour right here over here. And she says this really cool analogy that for many people, church is like a post office. So you go into the post office to post a letter, and then you go out of the post office. So if someone was in the post office and they offered you a sausage sandwich, you go, well, that's a bit random. You go, I didn't come here for a sausage sandwich, I'm going. So if someone's come and here's your task, here, Christian, there's your task, right? I'm sure they've got other psychological things going on there, but Cameron would say your lived experience means it's a predictor of future behaviour. So that if you are you've seen other people doing all these tasks and there's all these ministries running, then you're like, well, no, I'm on this roster, not that roster. I'm not on the roster to care for people today. I'm on the roster to write a sermon. And it's such a strange compartmentalisation that we have. One last thought. I know you wanted to close off, but I actually also wonder if it's partly a European thing, because talking to my Aboriginal friends up in Fingal one day about the differences between Anglos in Australia and Aboriginal people, is my friend Kyle once said, here's an analogy, Stu, that I want to tell you. He said, imagine a wheat field and there's a fox in the wheat field, and the wheat field is this beautiful big wheat field, and on the side of the road looking into the wheat field where the fox is an Anglo and an Aboriginal person. This is his theory. I don't know if this is true, but he says that as the white person looks at the field of wheat, his theory is he thinks that we see the sameness and we just look at all the wheat and we miss the two ears of the fox that are in the field because we're actually paying attention to the sameness. But then the Aboriginal person will look at the field and see the fox, because he believes that in his culture they're trained to see difference. And in his case, he thinks that's a hunting skill that we don't have. And he had actually just before that been trying to teach me some hunting skills that I'd failed miserably at, and he used that story to explain to me it's not just my lack of personal ability that's led to that, it's my lived experience. He didn't use those words, but he was saying you've been brought up in a culture that's taught you to see sameness, and I've been taught to see difference. And with that person who's getting the bin out, I don't think people have been trained to see that. And because of their life experience, for whatever reason it is, psychologically, they're not seeing that person carrying the bag. They just look at them and they're just not there. And I wonder as Christians if we need to train ourselves to see the difference, to see the important moment that we can be serving God and bringing glory to God by simply getting up from a conversation and quietly going over and say, "Oh, can I grab that bag?" Like that would bring glory to God to do that. It would be a slight discomfort, a slight awkwardness as I interrupt a conversation, but it would actually bring so much more glory to Him. And as a selfish, sinful human being, of course I live my life as a selfish person. I only see myself. But if we can see the ears sometimes, I think that would be a really terrific thing. And church isn't a post office. We shouldn't come just to be transactional and hear a sermon and be fed and talk with a few people. We should go. I think we should go asking the question: what can I actually bring to this space today that I can enrich someone's experience through just being kind and loving, however that might express. I don't know if that dovetails again with anything you're thinking, but that's what I was thinking there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to wrap up, the one thing I was thinking in terms of your compartmentalizing of different roles and responsibilities, and this is something I'm constantly trying to communicate to the kids cheerleaders, is you are always a kids leader, and sometimes you're rostered on.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Which
most
of
Lou
them
says
struggle
that with welcoming too.
And a lot of them struggle with that because a lot of them are just assume that I'm on the roster once a month or once every 8 weeks, and that's the week that I talk to kids.
Yeah,
and it's like,
wow.
Mate, you can actually talk to kids every week.
I'm off the rest of it. It's not my time on.
That's right. And so they compartmentalized relationship with kids as a task that they do on a roster, not that these children are part of my community and I am raising them alongside everyone else here. We are the village raising these children in the faith together. It's kind of like, oh no, I'll talk to Leo the week that I'm on kids, and the 7 weeks I'm not on kids, I won't talk to Leo. So why? Like, is he a task that you are performing, or is he a child in the village that you are helping raise as a disciple of Jesus? And for most people, again, it's just that lived experience. I find it particularly for those who have come from other churches where the roster system was just the assumed way you did all ministries. That they come here with this experience of, kids ministry is just a roster. So I don't cook bacon every week. Like the weeks I'm not rostered on cooking bacon, I don't turn up and help cook bacon. So, and it's not assumed that I would cook bacon. I wouldn't rock up and you think, why aren't you cooking bacon? Because someone else was rostered on that week. And it's just like, no.
Where's the bacon guy?
Where's the bacon guy?
Where's the bacon guy? I want some more bacon.
But there is this fundamental difference between the welcoming and, the kids chill and all these there are aspects of the church which we help us to live together and function together as the community of God. And there might be weeks that we particularly ask you to intentionally put that role on, but it's not like being on the washing up roster or the bacon roster. Like not everyone who's on the reading roster will read every week. Okay, that's fine, but this is a different kind. This is relational. This is our community. This is our life together. And so, of course, we're going to do these things every week. Well, that should be the assumption. That's what we want to build in the relationships. That we want people to see these things as every week, all the time things. It's essential for my relationship and my discipleship and for Leo's discipleship that I say g'day to Leo every week, even the weeks I'm not on chill. And for everyone to come to church with that expectation, that if someone walks in through the door and they're new, I don't look at my watch and go, oh, was I welcoming this week? Oh, I guess I am. I guess that I'll go and say good day. Like, oh, no, I'm not on for 2 weeks. If they come back in 2 weeks' time, I'll talk to them. Like, it's just a fundamentally wrong way of viewing what church is and what we are doing together.
So what's cool about that is you've just raised another issue we could come back to another time, which is specialisation, which is another part of the success of the industrialisation that we've experienced, that we're now industrialising church, but not just church, but our own individual relationships with people and ourselves. We're like, okay, I'm compartmentalised into all these specific specialisations, and actually if those people over there are better at looking after teenagers than me, then it makes sense to be more efficient to actually get them to minister to the young people instead of me. But the outcome is actually, specialisation is, good for some things in the church, but it actually is...
Maybe reducing resilience.
Maybe it's stopping people connecting with churches because we're we're waiting for somebody else to have the specialisation to help the coughing person who's having the coughing fit. Oh, the nurse will go and help that person.
Yeah, well, and that's it. Like, so you have the people who are on Kids Chill or Welcoming. They're parallel examples. For them, it's like, no, you're on every week. Like every week, talk to kids. But then you've got those who have not put themselves forward for Kids Chill, and I think they are probably in that specialisation of, I never have to talk to kids.
No,
I don't even. Do we have kids here? I see little halflings walking around half the time. I wouldn't have a clue what their names are, who they belong to, what their interests are. It's like, you're allowed to care. Like, you're allowed to be involved in these people's lives. But again, I think because we have this specialisation, particularly of kids ministry, youth ministry, and maybe Welcoming fits in there as well, unless I've been tapped on the shoulder and appointed into that speciality, therefore I don't have to think about that. I only have to think about the 2 or 3 people who I've come with and my friends.
And that's why people don't volunteer for stuff, because if I do end up saying I'll do that, then no one else is going to help me. But if everybody's looking after the kids, then you're more likely to go, I'll be a part of it.
Absolutely.
It's like just what we're all doing.
Yeah.
It's not a job description. That's how I'm kind of seeing it. It's like, no, we're called to do much more. I think that's what you guys are saying. So yeah. Well, we will wrap it up there, but as a sneak peek for next week, practice 4, to ground and motivate an ambitious generation, train for vocational discipleship. So you can start thinking about that now. But I did want to finish the episode with we mentioned Dave Stone Street before. He's actually emailed in a couple of times, but he was inspired by your watching of Australia Come Fly With Me. And remember, we talked about what it was like on the early airliners, and he sent through a video of Pan Am's 1958 launch of their Boeing 707 service.
Did he? Yeah, right.
So I'll put that in the show notes. Yeah. But it's kind of cool. Like, everyone gets their own table, like sits in front of a big seat. And
I would love to experience it. Actually, one of the airlines should just bring it back, and it'd be too expensive. I'm sure
they charge a fortune for it. But
it's just so fun to try it. Like, get 15 business people like smoking up the back and no seatbelts.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, he said
massive chairs.
The commercial planes in the 1930s had to fly low in the weather because their cabins were unpressurized.
Yeah, yep.
There you go. And the first commercial passenger plane with a pressurized cabin was the Boeing 307 in 1940. So it could fly at 7,500 metres rather than 3,000 metres.
Is that right? Yeah, right.
There you go. He also echoed your enjoyment of space, Stu, and said that his space heroes are the crew of the much less famous Apollo 8 mission. He'll explain why sometime when he sees you.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that, David.
I've invited him on the podcast, so maybe he can talk about it.
Well, let's have David on the podcast.
Yep.
David has taught me so much about life that I'll leave you with another thought just as we finish that David taught me, which is if you choose to do something, then you're choosing not to do something else.
Yes, right.
And I think that's one of the most helpful things, David, you've shared with me. There you go.
There you go. Well, we look forward to him coming on and sharing many more of those helpful learnings. But today I've learned a lot from you guys, so thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed listening or watching, whether you're on YouTube or on your favourite podcast app. My name is Joel, and you can email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au, if you have any other questions or queries or flights of Pan Am to send me, and we'll share them on the podcast. But for now, thank you very much, and thank you, Stu and Tim. And
Thanks, Joel. You're awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, and we'll finish with a one way.
One way.
Thank you.